Okay, thank you. Philip, thanks so much for inviting me to chair this last panel of what has been an incredible day of discussions on so many themes that really have relevance when you look at the legacy of the British Empire in the imposition of colonial law and the ongoing impacts for LGBT people who are also, affected by racism, by immigration challenges, by COVID-19, and by so many of the other factors that we've discussed today, press freedom, democracy. It's all something that our communities are also engaged in and affected by. So it's really a pleasure to round up the day by having this amazing panel of three activists. So we've had panels that have been all academics, and we've had panelists that have been a mix of officials, academics, and activists. We did have one panel that was also mostly activists. I thought it was important to have these three really esteemed Commonwealth-facing advocates to be able to reflect a bit on the history of their interventions over the last several CHOGMs, as we are not able to intervene in CHOGM this year, and also to share their national struggles. And we've got three really interesting models to reflect on. One is the sort of top-down constitutional reform that happened in South Africa and the aftermath of that in the last 2 decades to try to ground that in people's lived reality. We have also an opportunity to look at Malta's example of quite a holistic reform of law and policy that has really had meaningful effects on those who've been discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. And lastly, also to focus on the important interventions of particular people who put their neck out to challenge their government, with the chief plaintiff in a case in Belize that has overturned what was still the existing colonial era penal code that criminalized homosexual sex. So I think these three national examples are really important to focus on legacy. And all of these advocates have had their own interventions at numerous CHOGMs. I think this is a moment that it's very important for us to reflect on what's next, not only with the Commonwealth as an institution and all its member states, but also Britain's role as the current chair in office of the Commonwealth, which it will retain until the Rwandan government can take up the chairship when it hosts the next CHOGM at some point potentially next year. Britain has to really reflect at the moment about what it's going to do now that it has reformed its foreign policy, development, and Commonwealth-facing responsibilities in a new department that was announced only a week ago in Parliament. And it's been met with a lot of critique, particularly from those of us who have great experience working with the Department for International Development in an autonomous model that was highly effective. And also seeing how Britain has emerged as a leader within its foreign affairs priorities. So without further ado, I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to briefly say a bit about their profile as a professional and as an activist. And then we're going to go through a series of interventions that will help map out that story. So why don't we just go with, Gabi, will you first make an intervention?
Sure. I'm only putting on the microphone when I need to because there are dogs around and I never know what's going to set them off. So, but it's great to be here with you. So some background about myself. I became involved in LGBTIQ equality activism way back in 2003 with the Malta LGBTIQ rights movement, which was an organization that was very much in its infancy at the time. It was founded in 2001. And at the time mainly was, this bunch of people who felt that something needed to be done, weren't quite sure what, but knew that the community needed support and that the LGBTIQ issues needed to be given more visibility. It was still very much a stigmatized reality at the time. And it was hard to actually find people who were willing to talk to the media openly and to be out and to sort of give a face to the LGBTIQ community. So that was the initial experience with the movement. Malta's experienced quite rapid sort of change in the past 7 years, but we had quite a long period of time where really nothing much seemed to happen. So it was hard sometimes to just stick in there and you know, keep working at it and you know, keep developing and our work and sticking to our vision of what we wanted our country to look like. What else can I say? Well, I was the coordinator of the movement between sort of 2007, 2018, which is when I became part of the establishment, you could say. So I now had recently set up a government unit, a SOGIDESC unit, whose task is to implement the government's LGBTIQ equality strategy and action plan, which is really just this government commitments in a range of spheres and interministerial to address LGBTI equality. I think I can stop there for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabi. Steve, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Felicity, and thanks. Good evening to you, colleagues, and for those who are still in the morning mode, like Caleb, good morning for you, colleagues. Look, my name is Steve Letsike. I work with Access Chapter 2, which is a human rights organization in South Africa, but I'm also the co-chair of the Commonwealth Equality Network, you know, which brings together, you know, LGBTI organizations from across the countries of the Commonwealth. I'm quite excited, not only just as a member of TSEN, but also, you know, looking at the history and, you know, the pockets of excellence that we have had over the years to really advance, you know, the LGBTI work, you know, in South Africa, in the region. And actually today here in Africa, Gabon had announced a decriminalization of, you know, same-sex relations. So it's quite exciting conversations that we're having here in the region. So while we also are painful of the situation in Kenya, which is also another challenge of the LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers in Kakuma. And I think it's something that we need to ponder our head around. How do we collectively, you know, make, you know, contribution to get the people who are stuck in the refugee camp of Kenya there. So for me, I mean, I have been working in the movement at least for the last 16 years now, and you know, it has had its own roller coaster way, and it's not only just around making sure that the constitution that enshrines rights, you know, on and protection on the basis of, you know, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, but it's also the legislative pieces that accompanies, you know, the constitution in South Africa. I mean, we've got quite a lot. We have about 21 pieces of legislation that speaks to LGBTI rights protection, from you know, Employment Equity Act to adoption to civil union, you know, and so forth. So those protective measures, you know, are what we are still fighting to ensure that they are lived reality and moving from you know, talk to action. In fact, South Africa is known to be talking a lot. We do create beautiful globally recognized documents, but at times it takes its strain in terms of how these very same rights are lived reality. And the name of my organization, Access Chapter 2, actually was founded on, the fact that Chapter 2 is the Bill of Rights of our own constitution. And our mandate is really to facilitate that these rights are a lived reality for many. So I'm quite excited that we are having this conversation, in the back foot of COVID experience and challenges that we still live through. We are still in level 3 of our lockdown regulation, and there has been quite immense challenges that we live through. Thank you, Felicity.
Thank you, Steve, so much. And I hope we get to reflect more on that current context. Caleb, over to you. 5 minutes. First 5 minutes. You're muted, which is very unlike you. There you go.
These accusations of being muted scares me. So I'm your resident rebel rouser. I leave the regal language to my colleagues over there because they do a nice job of it. I too work with the Commonwealth Equality Network along with Steve on the management committee. But I also do a lot of networking at the OAS since 2008, and we've been able to pass LGBT resolutions in 2008 with Belize, co-sponsoring LGBT resolution in 2018 and 19 at my request. I can say that now because before they wouldn't have listened, but that's another note. With regards to the civil rights work that we do, I run the oldest and only LGBT-led policy and advocacy organization in the country of Belize. With we use a civil rights lens. So what do we do? I was a sole litigant in the decriminalization of all sodomy law that has shaped and influenced the way litigation is happening in the Caribbean. I've worked hard with the system to advance the anti-discrimination legislation and hate crime legislation, which is ready to go to Parliament in July. I pray that we can get the damn thing passed before government says elections time. I manage the only functioning human rights observatory here where we collect data on violence and discrimination that deals with sex workers, marginalized women, LGBT. And I led the way in writing human rights reports to the International Covenant for Civil Political Rights and the Universal Periodic Review since 2009 for Belize. And I'm proud of that because that has been leveraged to get my government to state formally in the international community what their position is on LGBT Belizeans. Now that you know that, let's get to the juice of the matter.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very concise. I appreciate that. Okay, so the juice of the matter, I think some of you have started to mention what the first point I'd like you to cover is, which is really the legacy of British imperialism impacting LGBT plus people in your setting, and as you've been exposed extensively to your colleagues across the Commonwealth, impressions on the impacts in other settings. And maybe we'll go in the same order. So Gabi, over to you.
Yes, well, Malta has had a succession of colonial rulers, so it wasn't just the British, there were many more before them. The British were the last, and they ruled for 150 years, so they left quite a legacy, well, positive and negative, I would say. They've affected our education, our health, our legal systems. So, of course, it's in a sense very much a part of our culture. But as far as the LGBTIQ rights are concerned, like many of the other Commonwealth countries, we inherited the anti-sodomy laws, which were repealed in 1973, so quite some time ago. Not really from any desire to advance LGBTIQ rights at the time. And in fact, nothing really happened beyond that for many years, really, until Malta joined the European Union and had to transpose the EU's Employment Framework Directive as part of the acquis communautaire. So that was, in reality, the first reference to sexual orientation in our law came around, at least the positive reference came around through membership of the European Union. The work around raising visibility on LGBTIQ issues started really with MGRM, with the setting up of the Malta LGBTIQ rights movement, at least in a concerted way. There were some individuals before then who sort of were willing to come forward and sort of tell their personal stories, but in terms of advocating for rights and working to raise awareness, that was the beginning for us. Some people at the time chose to leave the country, make a life elsewhere where they felt more accepted, and as a small community and a small island, it's very hard to live in the closet, which was the reality for many people. It takes a lot of effort to hide who you are in our context. But still, there were some sort of community organizing in terms of people who organized events, which generally social events that brought people together. So that was happening. So I'm not sure we can only attribute it to British colonial rule, because Malta also has a very strong Catholic religious background, which also did not help in terms of addressing the stigmatization of the LGBTIQ community. But that's been our reality.
Thank you, Gabi. So over to Steve, also a country that's had more than just British rule and imposition of British law.
Yeah, no, thank you, Felicity. Not only just, the British rule and the British law, but we also have many struggles, of how the colonization just didn't only deal with, issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. There were many struggles. We have a history of apartheid, where, it was again the fact that the one skin color, which is white predominantly, dominated, and which was white minority dominated the society, and there's many losses, not only just human loss, but it's many loss of land, many loss of economic emancipation, and the rule of law that was used against many of the South Africans here undermine the context of people's existence, and race was predominantly the big issue then. But also similarly, that very same colonial law undermined women in the case that where many women were subjected, not just only from the legality of colonization, but also our own African traditional and patriarchy and misogyny took shape even in marginalizing women and women's bodily autonomy and self-determination in the very same context. We've seen also how colonization came with the context of religious fundamentalism as well, and we've seen that very same skin gender and sex in this context, but now even the sexual orientation that continue to be shaped and reshaped, to undermine existence of people. So South Africa is in its 26th year of democracy and independence, and we've seen the crafting of building of one country and rainbow country. And the fact that our constitution looks the way it is was to look at coexistence and repairing the injustice of the past. And that is the kind of unity and building of the South Africa we have currently. But it's building that in the context that repairing does not happen overnight. It means that you have to unlearn, undo, and quite a lot of damage that had repercussion and the impact of the very same apartheid era in this current time. And we are seeing that even in the democracy that we have, and even with the very same government that is being put in place to change the livelihood of many South Africans, the struggles are still continuing, because it's quite difficult to see that implementation taking effect. I did allude to some of the pockets of excellence, because the arms of states, are tested one way or the other. If you're not only just testing the role of government, cabinet for that matter, or the executive, you have to then test the judiciary, whether we have a very strong judiciary. Indeed, South Africa have a very strong judiciary system in place. And I think if there's one thing, we are holding on to the judiciary system to do just approach in terms of making sure that we can put the constitution in test. But similarly, it's not only that, it's parliament as well, and parliament, the role of parliamentarians. So all the time, because politics are quite diluted with many issues and many intersecting issues, you find it quite interesting that Parliament, even with the majority in Parliament, hold very diverse positions, even around the understanding of LGBTI issues, challenges, and actually what is needed to be put in place. I do think currently, we have a quite exciting period with a president who was one of the architects of the Constitution. And again, we are also fortunate, even for the leadership he's providing this year as the chair of the African Union. And I think this is where, there's an opportunity, and that is an added value in the region, in South Africa, but also in the region where we are starting to even converse more. The spaces of debate, of what equality means, what gender equality means, what speaking of human rights for all look like in the Africa. And it's not only just for South Africa, it's many African countries. We are seeing quite a number of changes taking place in many of our African countries. You would have seen Botswana, you would have seen Angola, Mozambique, and as I've said earlier, that with Gabon's recent news, and even Uganda, for a country like Uganda that has gone up and down, side to side with its own anti-homosexuality bill, to a point where there's almost a reversal of certain decisions that are taken by the government. So for us, I think it's quite important to look at the nature of how there's a flow of change, or a wave of change in Africa around a legislative framework and what creating an enabled environment looks like. I think we subscribe solely in with what the Commonwealth thematic focus is. I mean, of course, Commonwealth is a consensus-based space, with the interest of shaping and looking at collaborative effort within member states, of ensuring that there's a building and strengthening of economic relation, and of course multilateral conversations around social approach within the Commonwealth. And I think this is the very same principles of inclusivity approach as South Africa is taking. I do know there are certain challenges that we are faced with, like hate crimes. We do have quite a high rate of gender-based violence and femicide, that every 4 minutes a woman gets raped. But similarly, when you look at cases of LGBTI persons, of corrective rape, just 3 days ago, Kevin from Cape Town was stabbed by a 14-year-old. Kevin was gay, was openly gay, and you can actually see the magnitude of violence level, that even teenagers are becoming so extremely violent. So those are kind of challenges that we are dealing with, but also lack of access to services, the xenophobia, that we have to think even about the intersecting issues such as the effects of migration. So while South Africa looks like it's heaven to many of our African siblings in the region, but the moment people arrive and get to South Africa, the experience is quite different. People are homeless, no access to services. So we as organization have to tend towards providing those gaps that were actually guaranteed in the constitution, that were supposed to be done by our own government, and they are not happening adequately. But these are experiences that we are at as South Africa.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm sure you'll be able to reflect more on your strategies for confronting those issues nationally and in coalition with your siblings across the continent. Caleb, coming back to our question again about the legacy of the sodomy law that was imposed many, many years ago, when Belize wasn't even called Belize, and your own role in overturning that.
Okay. For me, before we start there, we must recognize, and my two colleagues acknowledges, that no LGBT person exists in any single identity. We as citizens, we are women, we are men, we are trans, and on top of that, we carry various ethnicities across the Commonwealth. That is important in this discussion, because when you talk about the Krim, there's so much other things to talk about. With regards to British legacy, we must recognize that the British Empire was over 35 million square kilometers. And how do you control 35 million square kilometers? Well, you develop a system of violence. And that system of violence can be noted with the Mama Rebellion, when 20,000 was killed. When you look at the 18th and 19th century rule under the British imperialism, some 60 million people experienced levels of famine in the Commonwealth. When you look at a simple thing like the Amritsar massacre in India in 1919, where people were protesting against British rule, there were between 379 to 1,000 people killed for protesting against British rule. With that said, when you look at the criminalization, you also have to look at the principle of governance. Why did the British spend so long trying to manage 35 million square kilometers of empire? Well, the ultimate goal was to generate wealth. And in generating wealth, it requires some level of control over citizens. And so when you look at things like vagrancy laws, which criminalize the poor for being poor, when you look at misogynistic laws, in this case, hateful laws against women, where those laws treated women as property, or as we know it in our law, chavels, when you look at the criminalization of LGBT person, you begin to understand that while we did not officially have a system, a caste system, legally, the British legacy was about creating a caste system of pecking off, where people were to be less than, and below that list is LGBT people. One of the things I learned is that systemic violence, as we are governed in the Commonwealth, doesn't eliminate itself. It evolves into things like stop and frisk. It evolves into things like hold and release. It evolves into things like jailing people for 24 hours or police brutality. And I mention these things because we are celebrating the progress of decriminalization in Belize in 2020, but it requires some sacrifice. It requires the driver, it requires structure, it requires visibility, and it requires taking risks, and it requires a troublemaker like me to turn up the entire society upside down. When you do that, nobody likes you for turning an entire society down. And for me, in the criminalization process, I had to challenge the church, I had to challenge the state, I had to challenge my own community, I had to deal with lawyers who didn't even want to deal with my case. But because of my level of stubbornness, we prevailed, and I did not back down from any that trust that comes my way. So, with regards to the discussion around British imperialism and Belize in particular, I see you create your own mistreatment by remaining silent, and I'll repeat those words until the day I die. I refuse to be treated with any indignities. I refuse to be told I can't do it or it was the right time, because I believe the best advocate for change and legal protection was me, because nobody else was going to do it. And that's the heart of the matter.
Thank you so much. I think we can probably all agree on that. I mean, the next question is very much coming from that discussion, which is really just a bit more anything you want to share on your national strategies to overcome all the legacies that you've mentioned, all the intersectional factors that impede on the lives of many, and particularly disadvantage those with difference based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. So just one last round on the national front, and then we're going to go into the legacy of the Commonwealth facing advocacy. Gabi?
Sure. Well, oops, there they are, sorry. Well, we used, strategies that are used everywhere, raising visibility, using the media quite a lot to amplify our voices. We were always a very small movement in numbers, but we seemed a lot more because in a way, the stigma and the taboo meant that we garnered the attention of journalists and therefore got coverage. Of course, also as a small country, we have direct access to our politicians. So we met with politicians on quite a regular basis. It's not that they committed to anything after those meetings, but there was a space for discussion and for us to put forward our debate. I think there was a process by which, as a movement, we had to build our own capacity. We started off not really knowing much about activism in general, and also about human rights. We weren't a team of human rights experts. We were just volunteers wanting to do something. So, but we joined international networks like ILGA and ILGA Europe, which from whom we learned a lot, and of course linking into the broader LGBTIQ movement means that we had role models, we had organizations and individuals who could inspire us and keep us going when things got difficult. But in reality, the major changes started to happen when political will came into the mix, and without the necessary political will, it's very hard to affect legislative and policy change. So that was really the game changer for us when in 2013 there was a change in government, when suddenly sort of the LGBTIQ constituency on political terms was recognized as being a forceful one, and a one in one way that could be exploited by politicians, but also that the movement could use to advance its aims. So those were our main strategies.
Thank you, Gabi. So Steve, you began to reflect on the strategy and sort of framework that your organization uses, and also some of the Pan-African work that is to come and some of the opportunities. So please, over to you.
Thanks, Felicity. I think also what's important, if you take the development of the constitution in South Africa, was to craft just more than the challenges that LGBTI persons were experiencing. But there we are, or there we were. We had people like Simon Nkoli, we had people like Bev Ditsi, Pimum Tetra, who were instrumental, one, to actually organize, the first, Pride in South Africa, which was in 1990, that took place even before independence. And I think it's quite important to recognize, why organizing for us in South Africa is quite important. So the crafting of the constitution took a few years, and we actually also give it to the role that the ANC, which is the African National Congress, played in ensuring that the inclusive language that does not leave sexual orientation and gender identity, behind. I mean, that was then that the Constitution was passed in 1996. But now, in terms of how we continue to organize in making use of the arms of states beyond the cabinet or the role of the cabinet. So ultimately, some of the work, advocacy work, lobbying work that happens with the executive, with government, but it similarly or parallelly goes hand in hand in lobbying members of parliament, in pushing the right policy framework and mechanism in place. But what is quite important is that the LGBTI organizations that have been working towards collecting data, evidence, doing research. I mean, the first levels of empowerment research study that was done in 2004, it's quite important because that already told us what is happening, the situation and experiences of LGBTI persons within the health system, within the education system, within the justice system, how LGBTI continue to experience secondary victimization and so forth. So that element of research, that's when it kicked on in 2004, and we continued to develop the body of work around data collection to demonstrate what policies must change for South Africa. And we still do that, not only just on the basis of changing policy, but to hold our own government accountable for the commitments that it has based on the Constitution. I think also the key example is that if you have an issue, and we do it very well in South Africa, we are not voiceless. We raise our voice. South Africa, whether it acts irresponsibly outside the country or our member of parliament says homophobic statements, we are on to you. You are not just going to be irresponsible while you are occupying public office. And that is what, freedom of speech, of expression has guaranteed for us in South Africa. So we do utilize the rights that are enshrined there. I mean, recently, our deputy president, who, by the way, I co-chair the South African National AIDS Council with, as a part of the portfolio responsibility I have here. The deputy president spoke about the situation in Uganda just last year in November in Parliament, where he was actually calling on South Africans to respect country sovereignty and not be of sister or sibling, where we should not even speak about human rights violation. And immediately we took him on. A press statement, it goes out. We go and you have to come out and apologize or clarify the statement in where you're coming from. We cannot, when even our own foreign policy stipulates that our responsibility as a country, even whatever we do outside, is to maintain that we protect and promote what is enshrined in the Constitution, where we respect human rights, where we respect integrity and autonomy of people, and we act otherwise. So I think for us, interventions has always been how we organized. And we used to have what we call the Joint Working Group in South Africa, which brings together all the LGBT organizations and will identify a specific advocacy agenda where we will organize around it, where we'll identify our own deliverables as individual organizations, and we come together to then say, this is what we are aiming for. We work a lot with lawyers. We work a lot to ensure that, whatever strategic litigation or public strategic litigation is needed takes effect. And that's how we make use of testing the judicial system. So our strategy is not to allow our government to go outside their mandate, but we monitor and we advocate for what is. So we demand our rights, basically.
Indeed, you do. Thank you so much, Caleb. Demanding your rights. Any more reflections on your national strategies at the moment? You've mentioned, yeah. Go ahead.
So, what my two colleagues allude to are two things. Size doesn't matter. I like Gabi's point on we weren't a big movement. Well, we weren't a big movement in that regard, but we were a loose movement of hundreds of people debating the issues on Facebook forever. For example, social media was an important platform for us to debate our opponents, and that spilled over to national news month in, month out. So that's one important element to amplifying our presence and the political voice. The other element, and so in advocacy or in working towards decriminalization or advancing legal protection, if you will, it's clear that for small countries, a transnational approach, which is international, is equally important for the national approach. Now, what was our transnational approach? We use a political system, whether it was the Universal Periodic Review or the International Covenant for Civil Political Rights, or the OAS LGBT resolution for over the last 10 years, or networking with organizations like the University of West Indies Rights Advocacy Project to then drive the litigation agenda anti-crime, and then complementing that with our partners, Human Dignity Trust, to then argue the international point in our case. Those are our elements of our transnational framework, and it was built organically. When we add things like meetings with the High Commission for Canada, we add meetings with the European Union Diplomatic Corps, and they ask the question to our foreign minister, then it brings to the attention of the foreign minister the importance of the government of Belize to then address LGBT issue in a constructive manner, which they did. But to have diplomats speak to those issues is not enough. You need the teeth, knowing full well among CARICOM member states, in my own country, political leaders' backbone are left in their bed, not or placed in the closet, not in the public. And so that backbone has to be pulled out. And the way you pull that out is through litigation, through the court. Now, there are all these nice language that my two colleagues point out, but I will wrap it up and see that in demanding your rights, you must have a big legal stick. And if you can't find a big legal stick, you find something even bigger, which is the international community, to beat down your point. So those are my elements. And as a rebel rouser, I don't appreciate politicians telling me it's not the right time or they can't do nothing about it, or in cowardice in their approach in telling me, well, take it to court. You are a leader of a country who is supposed to protect all citizens. Your homophobia and your misogyny should have no bearing on the fact that you have a responsibility to protect me. But what I realize among Caribbean states is that political leaders are satisfied if you have a job, if you can eat, if you can have housing, but they don't feel no responsibility for anything else, especially in the area of violence. In fact, for people like us to want to get legal protection, they see, well, it would disrupt the order of society. Well, I'm not the one having 5 children and leaving them to feed themselves. That disruption already has been done away with by the heterosexual. So that's not an argument. The other argument I've heard is we're a Christian society. No, we're not. In the Caribbean, for example, I believe it has the 3rd highest rate for sexual violence. Come on. Hypocrisy prevails, and so my job is to challenge that not only with the litigation, but also exposure. And I've had over 300 interviews across our media platforms to let politicians know you have an opportunity to raise the bar of how you govern and protect your citizens, or you have an opportunity to be lambasted. And so in recognizing that, I've managed to engage them at the OAS. They co-sponsored the LGBT resolution in 2018 and 2019. And I was asked once, I hope Caleb is happy. Yes, I am. You're raising the bar. I was asked one by my foreign minister to do this crazy thing about participating in our Guatemala border dispute. I had to turn my head to ask, why you are telling me that? I just shamed your government. But the man is open in dialogue. I agreed. And in return, he then instructed his people to advance a universal periodic review to address the development of a National Human Rights Institute. So I've learned the principle of I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and that's a principle I love in dealing with two-faced, double-talking politicians and diplomats who politely watch you suffer and say, have a good day. I don't have that much tolerance for that. With regards to the other thing, I run a human rights observatory, recognizing that the legal decision which we finalized in December 2019 is not enough. They will not march on to advance anti-discrimination legislation. You have to find the money. So I facilitated the introduction to get the money. We're now in a good place to advance the Equal Opportunities Bill and the hate crime legislation. First, we're in the Caribbean state, and I will pressure, push, nudge, pull, and the people who needs to be pulled to make sure those bills gets to Parliament in July. Now, they may not like my approach, but I have a clear vision of what needs to happen when, and I want to say this clearly. Even if you have the legislation, even if you get a court decision, hearts and minds of people don't change that easily. And the ideals of our Constitution is not given life of the victim unless the victim themselves are supported legally in court. And we've done that on many, many occasions with addressing slave labor for one of our lesbian clients, in addressing COVID curfew for a trans woman who had to enter Belize illegally because she ran out of money. And we had to work towards getting her medication for ARVs. The court still charged her $500 US. We were fine with that because she wasn't dead. But the point is, you can't be gutless in this work, be polite with politicians, and expect change to happen. The theory of change doesn't happen without sacrifice or action. I close with that.
Thank you. So I had the absolute honor and pleasure of working with these three activists in 2015 when we made an unprecedented series of interventions towards the CHOGM. And I want to acknowledge that we have two esteemed colleagues on the line today from the Kaleidoscope Trust, which was the coordinating agent of the Commonwealth Equality Network, which Steve is the vice chair of, and Caleb's on the management committee of. And Gabi's been an important active member of. I'm the former executive director of that organization, and
Gabi used to be the management committee member as well.
yes, yes, yes. Let's not forget those hours in meetings and reading strategy documents. I just wanted to mention that in particular because when we talk about the Commonwealth facing advocacy and the strategies for LGBT people, I think there were interventions previously, but I think it was until we as a team at Kaleidoscope with the activists who were engaged at that time, and the group has gone from strength to strength since then, saw an opening because the CHOGM was being hosted by Malta, and Malta had been leading in this incredibly progressive way on national law reform. This was a moment where we had a number of institutional actors and backers who wanted us to go for it. So I'm not going to take you all in turn. I'd like to see if you could dialogue a bit about that particular year's interventions, and then also to focus on when you regrouped again for the next CHOGM in 2018, which was hosted by the UK, what were some of your other interventions? So really between the three of you, we have historians in the audience, so people like also recent history, and I don't think TSEN's history has been that well documented in a public stage other than the stakeholder groups that have been involved.
Okay, so I'm excited about this because there are all kinds of leveraging that took place. So let's talk about the work with the Parliamentarians for Global Action, and specifically the All-Party Parliamentarian Group, the ABP. What I love about that group is that if you are an activist from the Commonwealth and you have a very clear ask, you could ask them and they would take it to Parliament and ask their question to get things going. So for Belize, for example, I love the fact that there were 5 questions asked with regards to the SEO response to LGBT concerns in Belize. 5. I didn't even know there were 5. I thought it was 1. So that's important. The next thing that was important to me was getting the High Commissioner for Belize at my office. I did not see them move that fast in a long while because I didn't even like them. But separately, what's important to me is that the Commonwealth Equality Network in itself, as a collective, was able to engage particular ministers to raise the concerns around resource mobilization. And it was interesting to see how the EJA, or I believe the Equality Justice Alliance Project, developed. And in 2018, in my mind, I believe it was maybe April 2018 at CHOGM, I was able to introduce our House Speaker and the Special Envoy, the Prime Minister's wife, to Human Dignity Trust. And building on that conversation, we were able to raise over $200,000 to facilitate the development of the hate crime legislation and the Equal Opportunities Bill. That to me is substance in moving the theory of change along. It wasn't just thought, there was action. Separately, what I saw was important was the political value of quarreling with your representative state, and then being of state, and then being on a panel, and then being jovial about the progress we made collectively and discovering this. Belize became a model country among Commonwealth states because we used legal reform and we used litigation to advance the criminal code amendments in the country. More importantly, the government of Belize did not raise the bar of homophobia. It played a neutral role in letting the two opposing sides fight it out in court and allowing the court to settle the matter, which in December 2019, it did not appeal the Court of Appeals decision. So the Commonwealth Belize gets much respect for that, but it had to have these quiet discussion, particularly with the Attorney General was invited to London, for example, for a speech, and he said very particularly, I'm paraphrasing, the issue of LGBT should not be a moral response, but a legal one. And that was a pleasant surprise because that was him being responsible. Now, they can say pleasant things, but at the end of the day, you still have to follow up. Now, at CHOGM, not only were the panels important, not only were the follow-up meetings important, it's clear that there was a leverage approach in the Commonwealth Equality Network where it wasn't just about raising awareness. It wasn't just about political meetings. It was about finding the resources to support members. That, to me, is what sticks to my mind to this day. I'll shut up now and let anybody add.
Gabi or Steve? Casting your mind back either to 2015. I mean, Gabi.
Yes.
I remember.
To be fair, I can't remember who reached out to me first, but someone from TSN anyway reached out to see how we could support raising sort of the LGBTIQ issues during the People's Forum and the CHOGM meeting, and perhaps also getting our politicians to include LGBTI equality in their speeches. That was really the limit of our intervention at the time, but it worked. So we're happy that it sort of raised the bar and then created something that could be built on in 2018 during the next CHOGM. So for me, it was very much a learning experience in terms of, getting to know activists from other countries in the Commonwealth, about which I knew very little, and I'm always in awe of my colleagues. They do a tremendous job in such difficult circumstances.
I also want to ask you, Gabi, because I remember a particular intervention you made from the floor on a panel that your minister, Helena Daly, was engaged in, along with both Steve and Caleb at the front of the room. And you were speaking very much as a citizen, what does this mean for me and my community as a citizen? And I think at that time, a lot of your reforms had been, made in the as people were saying earlier, the beautiful paperwork of it all, but you weren't feeling, I think, that lived reality change. So do you think CHOGM in Malta that year actually had an impact amongst your other colleagues in the activist community and the wider LGBT community on the island?
Well, I think it was one element in a host of others. So the LGBTIQ movement in Malta is very active, has been active, and as I said, has relatively easy access to politicians, and so is not afraid to make its voice heard. And since the 2013 general elections, has more of a weight in terms of what it says because of how it influences also elections as a movement. I think I wouldn't necessarily say that we weren't feeling the impact of legislation. I think there was a recognition that Malta had moved a great deal. What we didn't have is what Steve mentioned earlier, which was the evidence. So we weren't quite sure how the legislative and policy changes were affecting people's everyday experience. So that was a gap at the time.
Thank you for reflecting on that. Steve, I remember talking to you about TSEN, and then all of a sudden there you were, and going into a leadership position, as is very much your style, being a great organizer from your youth days onward. So reflecting on the time in Malta and afterwards in London, what are some of the things that you think were special about TSEN as a catalytic movement? You're still on mute.
Yeah, we got it. I think TSEN's story, will always be unique, in the history of the Commonwealth. And I think, most of it starts with a very few with a common vision. And in addition to that, amongst us as activists and the ones that are brought into place, like myself, to say, come join, here's TSEN, here's a space, because it's also around, a shared responsibility and a shared accountability that we have predominantly as activists across the Commonwealth countries, but also the responsibility we have as leaders of NGOs or civil society in our countries. And I think coming from Malta and seeing the traction of voices created in the spaces of People's Forum, Women's Forum, Youth Forum, whether it was one or two, because there were only just a few of us in Malta, but there was great impact because those few days we had in Malta had yield results. And there was traction. There was no way that you could speak of a communique that does not recognize inclusive language, of a communique that does not recognize the voices that were in the room, as you've alluded to what was said during the time and during the session itself. So I think for me, that on its own, we have actually represented the idea that you can have just two people out of 1,000 people speaking, and those two voices will still be remembered because they were not silent and they were never silenced. And I think that's the most important thing about how we organized TSEN and how we kept the conversation going. And I think it's also the great leadership that we've heard from the organizing local organizers in Malta, but also the leaders that came through from various countries. And I think it's also the pathway from Malta to London, the pathway that was paved in terms of the kind of tone we wanted to see. So the 2 years split between Malta and London had demonstrated the body of work and the investment, the effort of lobbying, of advocating, but also it has shown the power also of the will that we've had from governments of Malta, government of the British government, and of course also the other supporting governments such as Canada, Australia, because we've had allies who said, we trust you, be there, show up. And we've shown up. And we've created even a space where when we were only just 9 in Malta, when you got to London, you had over 45 delegates that TSEN brought into a session, where every session we were represented, where we had speakers in the opening sessions, we had speakers who were contributing in the drafting documents. We had speakers who were also part of panels. So already there was a trust issue between TISAN and the Commonwealth community. And I think that value, for me, it's quite important. And here we are. It's 2020. It was going to be interesting. And I think the fact that when we were in London during CHOGM, and the announcement that CHOGM is going to Malaysia, and that decision was also turned around because of the political situation there, but going into Rwanda. So it just didn't leave the idea of how would we keep to the level of peak that we have reached in terms of getting the regret view by the British government. The Prime Minister Theresa May standing in front of delegates and saying that the British government regrets, the colonial laws. I mean, that on its own, we definitely know it's not an apology, and it's also open for interpretation of what does that mean. But I think it's also about what potentially could the regret look like in many of our African countries. So I think we are at a time where we know exactly what needs to happen within our African states, and many of our Caribbean, many of our European, many of our Asian and Pacific Island states. I think what is quite important, we need more and more support for TISAN work. In fact, TISAN should never become weak from what it has become. There are still 71 countries, now 70, right? With Gabon's announcement, we are reducing the numbers one by one. There are still many countries across the world that still criminalize homosexual act. And of the 70s countries, 31 are still in Africa. And I think it leaves us with something that we need to think about, what it means to have 31 countries in just one region that still criminalize homosexual act. And I think this is why I'm saying TISAN should never be weakened, so in which we need to support where things are.
Thank you. Okay, so as we're reflecting now about, because of the pandemic, CHOGM is not taking place, what are some of the strategies for holding Commonwealth leaders to account in this interim period? And I would really invite any special reflections on the role of the UK as Commonwealth Chair in office. Many of you will be aware, as I opened the session, that the place of the Commonwealth in a reorganized system of diplomacy and development in a new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, it's not entirely clear on all sorts of fronts what this means for the commitments that have been made. The commitments that have been made to allocating official development assistance to programs that support LGBT people, what it means for the roles in the multilateral system. But the chairship is still being held. The Prime Minister, when he was queried about this, only by one parliamentarian who asked about the role of the Commonwealth during this announcement made last week, Prime Minister Johnson actually reflected on the Commonwealth as much more of a trading bloc, which is very convenient given that we are just about to leave the world's largest and one of the most effective trading blocs, the European Union. So they're open for business and looking for new partners. So please share, what are your strategies now to keep the visibility of the network high, of the movements in your country and other Commonwealth countries, and what you think the British government could do while it's still serving as chair in office to deliver on their commitments to upholding the human rights of LGBT people worldwide. And I will say they're concurrently holding the co-chairship of the Equal Rights Coalition and other multilateral fora to promote diplomacy and development that upholds the human rights of LGBT people. And that's an intergovernmental forum with a global remit. It's not a global membership of states, it's a select group of states. And the UK is currently co-chairing that with the government of Argentina. So over to anyone who wants to intervene on those points.
Well, I can start. Well, look, Felicity, I think it's quite important to recognize that, you know, TSAN's leadership or work is coordinated through the management committee and also through the support of the Secretariat Kaleidoscope Trust. And I think what has been the benefit to this is the work that is being done by regional representatives, but also members of the Commonwealth Equality Network. You know, we have had in the last couple of months a regional caucus, where within regional caucus was to look at priorities in the regions where, you know, you identify strategies of interventions, you know, where can we influence, how do we organize in the regions, because you can not only just also have a helicopter kind of conversations where things don't land. You ought to have conversations that find expression in the region, find expression in country work. Now, as for instance, as a South African member of TSAN, we work quite a lot to maintain, you know, visibility of TSAN work. One, in following up with our international relation department, so which is a foreign department or agency of our government. And I think it's quite important because there's a Commonwealth unit within our Foreign Affairs Department where you always have to keep up to saying, okay, what's happening? What is South Africa's contribution around the language of communique? Where are you going? But also the relation of foreign affairs, it's also about linking up with the work that is done by ambassadors or commissioners in countries that of interest. And it's quite important that we do so. But also the other part of work that was kept alive was through the work we did with the champions. So the champions, it's a work that it's all coordinated and brings together former heads of government. These are former presidents here in Africa. It was chaired by President Mogai, Festus Mogai of Botswana, and now currently, because he has stepped down, age is catching up with many of the former presidents, but now it's chaired by President Motlanthe, which is former president of South Africa. But these are former heads of governments from African states who are prepared to say, we have missed the opportunity in our term of offices to create just about change. And we are prepared to speak up because we knew, one, what was at cost then, and we also know what is at cost now, and we are prepared to stand up with LGBTI persons. And we've seen the excellent conversations that they have been facilitating around that. But also what has been kept alive, you know, following the regret announcement by the former Prime Minister Theresa May, there was a program that was established, which was the EJA, Equal Justice Alliance, program. And of course, the program was coordinated by 4 UK charities, KT, HDT, which is Human Dignity Trust, Sisters Change, and what was the 4th one?
Royal Commonwealth Society.
Oh, there, Royal Commonwealth Society. I thought, but I think this is one excellent program also that came out of the commitment by the UK government that focused on creating more and more champions, linking the work of civil society and capacity building and supporting regional efforts. But it also prioritized countries of focus to enable members of TSEN to participate and to advance its own work in that space. So I think there's quite a lot of work that is being done by members in countries looking at the mandate of their work, but similarly that looks at collective element of this, and interventions such as ERC, TSEN, and EJA processes are building up or building blocks that enables the agenda to still remain visible. I do get concerned on what is happening, of course, in the UK. There's certain things that have shaken us, the Brexit conversation of what is happening, because the UK government is the strongest ally to TSEN work. And really that does leave a concern to our work. So those who are continuing in the UK to work to support the work of TSEN, it's really about what will, TSEN look like without the kind of support that is needed. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just make a brief intervention to say that it wasn't always the strongest supporter of TSEN. I mean, I would say that initially the network was getting far more support from the Embassy of Canada to the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Yes, and also following that, quite a lot of leadership from the Embassy of Australia to the United Kingdom. But most of these things have been very London-centric. And I think that's important to reflect on how does this momentum also land, both at regional and national level. So Caleb or Gabi, any further thoughts? Please, Caleb, please, we really need some of your passion here to get, there is a big pushback going on around the merger of these two entities. And people are very frustrated. So please share your strategies.
It's not so much strategy as it would be reflection. One of the things I learned about advancing, making progress, is that you have to have a system of support. And at the heart of the system of support for the Commonwealth is our Secretariat, the Kaleidoscope Trust. And so they remain the eyes and ears of the network in terms of identifying the problematic areas and getting us to reflect on strategic action. So that's one. The second element here is recognizing the value of the ERC as a long-term political investment and using the co-chair relationship between, I believe, Argentina and UK to drive a set of priorities that is LGBT specific. And being part of the Equal Opportunities, the ERC CSO core group, there is a discussion, there was a attempt at developing a set of thematic priorities that has been going back and forth with the British government and the rest of the states in regards to us to refine those priorities. So that is an opportunity I think we can take advantage of. It won't trickle down the way we want as activists on the ground, but it has value for long-term movement. Separately, I've become obsessed with two things. And the first thing is looking at development finance investments and examining the values under which those investments operate. especially looking at the value of inclusion with regards to supporting marginalized populations who do not necessarily benefit from economic investments. That to me is important. And we don't have any data through the ERC. We don't have any data from our secretariat. I hope they're still there. Um, to to help us to understand the importance of driving the evidence or driving the advocacy for another narrow set of asks. And so those are opportunities which can be placed on the table. And lastly, with a colleague of mine from Washington, D.C., we've been discussing the idea of adding economic value to our contribution in the Caribbean. For example, there is no investment in adding what is our economic contribution to small states, especially among Caribbean states. What is your economic value with regards to our contribution in the Commonwealth? That to me is an important discussion that remains underdeveloped because we're so busy looking at the human rights element and setting up basic structures to address violence. With that said, it's clear though that whether the British government does anything specific, whether it's merging its system, it's clear that we carry the burden of responsibility to ensure that the value of inclusion, the value of human rights is not undermined by that merging process, and that we remain visibly at the table to ensure that if it's just a single budget item priority in the process, that single budget item is allocated. We will stress, we can talk about the political implication of merging the systems, or we can talk about the loss of experience that will occur because of the merger. But we can also be pragmatic in the way we focus the issues of budget allocation, thematic priorities, using the political systems we have that is available to us, and driving concerns forward in a tenacious manner. We can't be gutless in the idea that because changes come, that we are upset. We can't be gutless in our being upset. We have to always be smart, and we always have to be there at the table. I think that's the conversation that needs to be had.
Thank you, Caleb. And I'm also obsessed with watching the ODA allocations and how much harder it might become to track them appropriately, as they may be spent differently. I want to give Gabi an opportunity to respond as well. Philip, can I just ask if we can go slightly over time as we're closing out today? I know you were trying to stick to 90 minutes, but I would love to get a round of questions from our audience as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's if we go to about 7:40 or something, that's fine by me.
Great, thank you. I do realize you've been online since 8 a.m. on this, so I appreciate that.
Really, thank you.
Okay, great. So yes, Gabi, one last round on that piece around maintaining the Commonwealth visibility, and any thoughts on the role of the UK in delivering on that? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, that now more than ever in these times, it's important that human rights continue to be held as a priority, and that they don't take second stage to economic concerns. They should really be underpinning every decision that is made. So I think that counts for every state and every government around the world. The other comment perhaps that I would make is that for many years the UK was a country that we looked up to in terms of its LGBTIQ legislative and policy framework, and we've seen that things have sort of gotten also stuck a little bit at the national level in the UK, and this is a little bit of a concern. So the other I think element is that the UK really needs to be a role model, a good role model within the Commonwealth, a country that we can continue to look up to in this field. I think that's also very important. And of course, to maintain the commitments that it has made with regards to the Commonwealth countries that most need its support.
Thank you so much, and that's very true. There are many worrying signs on the international and domestic frontier. So, audience, how we work this is we don't unmute everyone. If you have a question, please put it into the chat box. I've got a previous question that our colleague Juan from Kaleidoscope Trust had shared with me earlier. And so I'm just going to start with that while people are typing any other questions. And Juan wanted to really reflect on, in this particular moment, given the pandemic, given a focus, maybe refocusing on inequalities in society, are there changes that you've made in your own work in terms of your short-term priorities? And how is that linking the sort of humanitarian responses with your long-term advocacy approaches? How are you balancing off? We know that Caleb was coming from multiple crisis points, that he spoke to some of them, and I know this is also what Steve deals with day in and day out. So how are you keeping your role as high-level advocates, and also keeping the community's needs, responding to those in all the hours that you have in the day?
Is that anybody? Is that an anybody question?
That's an anybody question, yeah.
For us, I have to start by saying I have a wonderful colleague named Elisa Castellanos. She's a driver of action, and she tells me all the time, don't wait for them people to send you money, do something. I was so frustrated, I ended up pointing out to our donors what are the list of issues affecting LGBT people around COVID. To my surprise, our donors responded, and we ended up getting some help thanks to Elisa Castellanos, who deals a lot, who's a human rights defender, does a lot of work in human trafficking, gender-based violence, and helps us on LGBT issues from time to time. Separately, I have found myself in a relationship in trying to address the needs of trans people in my country through the regional branch called UC Trans. And I'm trying to get them to mobilize in the rural areas to reach out to trans women who are in need. And so that conversation is ongoing. Now it seems like what they need is guidance towards the actual get things done. With regards to the COVID and the related civil rights violations, we haven't waited for the state, we haven't waited for donors, we haven't waited for anybody to tell us we needed litigation support. I've harassed exactly 31 people in the system for response to COVID, and rail up to the point that I didn't know that they committed $10,000 to a litigation work. I didn't ask them for $10,000 in litigation work for litigation support, but they submitted it anyway, I guess, to shut me up. And so what I'm saying is agitation goes a long way to drive home the short-term needs of what's going on locally, and recognizing that short-term needs must be complemented with long-term goals. And these are high-level discussions around ARC, high-level discussions around the FCU and DFID and the Commonwealth will continue to take place, but they can't wait for the needs of the people on the ground. So that's my response to that in regards to keep things going no matter what.
Thank you. If the other panelists don't have come back immediately to that, we've got two other really interesting questions from my colleagues, Matthew Waits and Corinne Lennox, who are very renowned scholars on these issues. So thanks so much, both of you, for joining. Matthew's question, it is specifically to Caleb, so I'm going to continue to give him the floor at the moment. What are your reflections on how resources, especially money, can be accessed transnationally by activists starting movements, e.g. in other Caribbean states? And how about this issue of resources conceptualized in analysis? And others are also welcome to comment on that.
One of the things I learned in my own country is this: the weakest population to take advantage of any transnational resources is the trans population. Because of the systemic violence I've experienced as an individual, both based on sexual orientation, based on gender identity, and the resulting economic devastation that occur with denial of education and so on, and the invisibility within responses like health and education, they remain an invisible population to access these opportunities. And so the question of mentoring and the question of leveraging skills in other letters of LGBT is an important part of ensuring that the trans population isn't left behind in this discussion. Beyond that, there's an issue of what do national organizations want in terms of accessing these resources. Now, I learned with the effort of Outright that they raised $1 million, but they received 1,500 applications, but they were only able to help, slightly over 100 organizations. When you're competing for resources like that at this need-based, it becomes problematic because it assumes that the burden of responsibility for advancing programs intervention is easily done with populations on the ground who actually have, who may, or in this case, may not have the capacity to mobilize themselves. Not all organizations or national movements are created equally in being able to access transnational resources or are aware of the value of international human rights institutions to this work. So a mechanism of exchanging ideas or a strategy becomes essential as part of the education process to take advantage of some of the things that are out there. But more deeply, the Caribbean, for example, is, while it will argue it has been on the road to movement building for 20, 30 years, it really hasn't gotten any significant momentum without litigation that have occurred. Let's talk about Belize for one. Belize took the lead in litigating all sodomy law that then shaped and influenced the development of litigation in Trinidad and Tobago, and then that equally helped to shape the approaches that has been occurring in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. But it needed a driver, it needed a rebel rouser, it needed a troublemaker to start the conversation around litigation resources, is to start the conversation about approach, and to get people to understand that visibility and challenging the system is as important as sitting around the table and having coffee and tea, which I will not have coffee and tea with you without ensuring that you leave that table and commit to something that I believe in. But that's another discussion. With regards to numbers, we still don't have numbers around our population size across Caribbean states. We just recently discovered that there's an estimation as high as 15,000 men who have sex with men. But what does that have to do with LGBT people who needs to understand their economic contribution, their barriers to systemic access to education, judicial system? So there's this whole invisibility of data that has been undermined because there's this belief that we're so small at the national level. At the regional level, I just came across the Caribbean strategic plan for CARICOM. But there's no discussion about our economic contribution. There's no discussion about our need for legal protection or addressing systemic violence across the region. There's this idea that violence affects us all the same way. And so that requires a little bit of organizing, a little bit of deliberate driving around how resources are allocated among CARICOM states with regards to the way they address explicit and implicit bias in the judiciary and the way they deal with a trauma-informed approach to investigating violence. So these are things that are that require a lot more work than just a virtual discussion, than just a report. It requires social infrastructure to drive the discussion to the end, and it requires that movements at the national level create new pool of people who are visionary, who are strategic, who understand systemic barriers to drive that change. Because old folks like me won't live to 190. We will die out. And so the new flesh, the new fruits have to be organized to flourish. So these are your elements that plays out in that discussion in the Caribbean specifically.
Thanks, Caleb. So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's one other question that Corinne Lennox has asked. I had said wrongly that it was the embassies of Australia and Canada to the United Kingdom. They are the high commissions, which actually has a bit more weight, and they do coordinate quite a lot of the Commonwealth structures here, and they at one time were giving quite a lot of funding to the Commonwealth Secretariat. So Corinne's question, and I'd like Steve or Gabi to intervene on this. We've heard a bit about other embassies in the UK being allies. What is your experience of UK embassies or high commissions in your country? The new merged department will give a much stronger role to UK ambassadors on the ground. That has been alluded to already by our Prime Minister. Do you think you can work with them, or would you have concerns about how to leverage their leadership?
I'll just make a brief comment. The UK embassy, as other embassies, such as the US embassy and the Dutch embassy, for example, have been important allies in the past. I wouldn't say that their intervention now is necessary in the same way as it was prior to 2013. So because LGBTIQ equality is part of government's agenda and is being mainstreamed within government, the role of embassies at the national level as far as LGBTIQ rights is diminished. Just to refer a little bit to the other question as well, in terms of COVID-19, of course, the situation is still evolving, so it's really difficult to judge at this point in time what the long-term impact is going to be. But my role as a head of the SOGIGESC unit and as chair of the LGBTIQ Consultative Council is to maintain the links with civil society organizations and to make sure that I'm informed of the situation on the ground. So I use my networks and my links through the Consultative Council with civil society to make sure that I'm understanding and I'm listening to what civil society is saying and to intervening with the various ministries and departments where necessary.
Thanks very much, Gabi. I'm so glad you're in that position. Not only is it a great credit to all the work you've done, but it's like a very effective insider. And Steve's also a very effective insider. Steve, you want to have one last chance to reflect on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks. In South Africa, the UK, I think the UK, embassy or consulate is becoming invisible. in South Africa. I mean, we've reached out several times. In fact, the Canadian embassy or consulate is the strongest supporter and visible supporter in South Africa. I mean, one could assume with the British embassy that it could potentially be that, when there was a change of leadership and so forth, but it's not like we have not reached out, we have not shared, some of the progress to date of work that we have been doing in country and outside the country. And I think for us, what was important to have active embassies, particularly those who are situated in South Africa, is the role they play beyond South Africa's borders, because not every country in the region has embassies. So for us to leverage on visibility, on the voice and support of embassies in South African country is not only just to help situation in South Africa, is to be able to help Lesotho, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and all others who are immediate neighboring countries where there isn't British embassy. So I think for us it is a concern about the invisibility of the UK embassy, and I'm hoping, I don't know if this situation will change, but it's almost at times that you can only knock until a certain time. If the door is not open and we move on, really, we do not have time for that. We come in a case of working relation and building partnership. But yeah, if they are not coming to the party moves somewhere else.
Steve, I remember standing outside the High Commission in Pretoria with you, waiting for some aid to go to another aid, even though they knew we were coming, and we were out there for over an hour. So I'm very sad to hear that, and I think it's a bit of a sad note to end on in a way, but I think a very realist one for us to realize that while the UK's chair in office of CHOGM, the Commonwealth, and co-chair of the Equal Rights Coalition, these are things that are happening at Capitol, and they're not being grounded in country, and therefore Britain's legacy is not being corrected following the former Prime Minister's regret. And I think it was important for you to also note that can be interpreted in many ways. So I hate to end on a sour note for that, but I think it's important for us to be realistic. And but we're ending a beautiful day, and I'm gonna hand back to Philip to close our session and our day out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. It's been, I mean, really kind of inspiring. I think this session will be watched by activists in other fields, and we'll learn an awful lot of lessons about how you deal with a series of different actors, both local and international. So it's been really inspiring. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Felicity, for helping to bring this panel together. And my thanks to my other colleagues, Sue and Winita, who also chaired panels, and Joanna and Carl, friends of the Institute, who chaired the two other panels. It's now almost exactly 12 hours since I sat down in this chair, feeling quite nervous, having had this idea, the slightly crazy idea, when I heard the real Commonwealth Summit had been postponed. And we've been, like I'm sure most of you, on this very steep learning curve of using online platforms to do what we would normally do face to face. And then suddenly realizing, maybe it was just sort of staring us in the face for me for 10 years. that for a small institute with a very small budget and a Commonwealth remit, this is the perfect way of bringing people together. And we've learned so many lessons. And so I'd had a bit of practice of using Zoom for different things, and so wasn't entirely terrified that the thing would just break down, but was still wondering whether people would show up in their time zones when the sessions were supposed to start. And it really has been wonderful. The quality of the discussions, the generosity of people responding to my requests to take part in this. I tended to go to people I really wanted to hear speak on these issues, and pretty much everyone said yes. And I'm so pleased that we recorded these sessions as well, because I think they'll be a really valuable resource. And some of the panels, reflect things that are ongoing research interests of the Institute. So Press Freedom, which Sue chaired, Windrush, which Juanita chaired, and Juanita's been doing some fantastic oral history work on Windrush. And the LGBT panel we've just had, chaired by Felicity, who's been, a fabulous researcher on the Strong in Diversity, Bold in Inclusion project at the Institute. So it's been really nice to flag up some of the things that we do as well. And I think that as a kind of overall message, I know I've been, people who know my work and my pronouncements will know that I've been pretty critical of the Intergovernmental Commonwealth, one way or another, in recent years. But it's worth remembering, even though if you Google Commonwealth, the first thing that comes up is the Commonwealth Secretariat. And the Commonwealth Secretariat has been very keen to present itself as the Commonwealth. That the Commonwealth isn't the Secretariat. The Secretariat has only been around since 1965. And if it disappears, there will still be a Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is not the Queen, although you wouldn't learn that from reading the British press, because the only Commonwealth-related things the press seem to be interested in are royal-related subjects. Even LGBT rights, the famous headline in the Daily Mail from 2013, Queen Fights for Gay Rights, which was actually about the Commonwealth Charter, which, as you'll be well aware, wasn't really a fighting document for LGBT rights, but they managed somehow desperately to get a royal angle on it. But the Commonwealth isn't the Queen. There's always been a intergovernmental Commonwealth, but there've always been other networks, often far more interesting networks, and often networks of resistance. If you read Priya Gopal's new book on anti-colonial movements, these links across the what was then the Empire, now Commonwealth, between Ireland, India, Africa, the Caribbean. And people have spoken today about the new opportunities for popular movements, popular activism. And that's maybe how we can find a new way forward in thinking about the Commonwealth and finding value in it, in these very rich associations and long traditions of resistance around those networks. So thank you again to all our speakers, our chairs, and all of you for staying with us. And it's been a wonderful day. Thank you all very much indeed. And I say have a good evening, but some of you are still in morning. Have a good, rest of the day. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.